My name is Mia Carter. I'm 37 years old, and most people who meet me for the first time describe me with words like calm, polite, or sometimes quiet. I live in Portland, Oregon, in a house that sits on a narrow street lined with maple trees that turn red every fall. I work as an estate and property manager, which basically means I help families handle complicated assets, homes, trusts, paperwork that nobody wants to think about until it suddenly matters. But the truth is, the job didn't come first. The skills came from my life. For most of my adult years, people around me assumed something about my personality that wasn't entirely wrong, but wasn't entirely right either. They assumed that because I didn't interrupt people, because I didn't raise my voice, because I didn't argue every time someone overlooked me, that I didn't see what was happening. And when someone believes you don't see things, they behave very freely around you. That's how this story began. It started with something small, not dramatic, not explosive, just a sentence spoken in a living room full of family members. A sentence that sounded polite on the surface. Maybe it's better if you stay out of the meeting, Mia. No one shouted. No one insulted me directly. In fact, most of them probably believed they were being reasonable, because in their minds, the meeting wasn't really about me. It was about family decisions, important discussions, things the men in the room would handle. At least, that's what they believed. What they didn't realize, what none of them had paused long enough to check, was something quietly sitting in the background of the entire situation. Something legal, something documented, something that had been true for years. The house we were sitting in, the one where they closed the door to that meeting, was mine. I didn't reveal that immediately, not because I was afraid, but because understanding people often requires patience. When someone underestimates you, they tend to reveal far more about themselves than they realize. So I listened, I watched, I waited, and what unfolded over the following months wasn't revenge. It wasn't dramatic confrontation. It was something quieter, a slow moment of resignation, of realization spreading through a room of people who had believed they understood the situation, only to discover they had misunderstood the most important detail. This story isn't about humiliating anyone. It's about something far more ordinary and far more powerful. What happens when someone who has been quietly underestimated for years finally stops correcting the misunderstanding and simply lets reality arrive on its own? So today I'm going to tell you how a family meeting I wasn't supposed to attend ended with a sentence that changed the entire room. They closed the door, I owned the keys. Before we begin, I'm curious about something. Have you ever had a moment where people assumed you had no power in a situation, only to discover later that the truth was very different? If you had asked my family to describe me 5 years ago, most of them would have used the same few sentences. Mia is dependable. Mia's always been the responsible one. Mia doesn't like conflict. None of those things were wrong, but they weren't the whole story either. In our family, people tended to fall into certain roles very early, and once those roles were assigned, they rarely changed. My older brother Daniel was the decisive one. My cousin Mark was the outspoken one. My uncle Robert was the one everyone deferred to when serious matters came up. And me? I was the one people called when something needed to be handled quietly. Paperwork, phone calls, scheduling, documents that required patience instead of opinions. It started when I was in my 20s. My grandmother had begun struggling with the early signs of memory loss. Nothing dramatic at first, just small things. Forgetting where she placed documents, losing track of appointment dates, confusing bills that arrived in the mail. The rest of the family found those details exhausting. I didn't, so I stepped in. At first it was simple tasks, organizing files in labeled folders, setting reminders, helping her sort through letters that had been piling up on the dining table. But slowly, the responsibility grew. When my grandfather passed away, someone needed to review the insurance paperwork. Someone needed to talk to the bank. Someone needed to understand the language inside the trust documents. No one volunteered, so I read them. I remember sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table one rainy afternoon, stacks of legal papers spread across the wood surface while the sound of the kettle boiled softly in the background. The documents were complicated, but they weren't impossible. They just required patience. And patience, as it turns out, is a skill many people underestimate. From that point forward, I quietly became the person who understood how things worked, where documents were stored, which accounts existed, which assets belonged to whom. But something interesting happened at the same time. The more responsibility I handled behind the scenes, the more invisible I became in the conversations happening out front. Family dinners were a perfect example. Everyone would gather around the table, conversations moving quickly between topics. Investments, business decisions, property discussions. And whenever a complicated detail appeared, someone would say something like, Ask Mia later, she'll know. They didn't mean it as an insult. In fact, they often said it with appreciation. But notice what that sentence really meant. Not let Mia explain now. Not Mia understands this better than we do. Just ask her later, as if the person who understood the system was somehow separate from the conversation about it. For a long time, I accepted that dynamic without questioning it, partly because it felt easier. Conflict has never been something I chase. And partly because I understood something about human behavior that most people overlook. People tend to reveal their real assumptions in the spaces where they believe no one is challenging them. When they think you're simply the helpful one, they stop guarding their words. They speak freely. Over the years, I watched patterns emerge. Who interrupted whom? Who made decisions without checking facts? Who assumed authority simply because no one corrected them? And I listened, not because I was planning anything, but because listening is the fastest way to understand the invisible structure of a room. By the time my grandmother passed away, that structure was very clear. Certain voices were considered important, others were considered supportive. Mine fell firmly into the second category. Reliable, quiet, useful, but never central. So when the family began discussing what to do with the house, the one my grandparents had lived in for more than 40 years, no one thought to ask me what I already knew. They simply assumed I would continue doing what I had always done, handling details quietly in the background. And that assumption is what led to the meeting they asked me to stay out of. A meeting that happened in a house whose ownership they had never fully understood. But to explain how we arrived at that moment, we have to go back a little further. Back to the first time something small happened. Something so minor that everyone else forgot it immediately. Everyone except me. If you try to trace the beginning of a shift in any relationship, it rarely starts with something dramatic. Most of the time, it begins with something so small that no one feels the need to comment on it. A sentence, a glance, a decision made just slightly outside your presence. For me, that moment happened about 8 months before the family meeting. It was a Sunday afternoon at my Uncle Robert's house, the kind of afternoon where everyone gathers after lunch, plates still stacked in the kitchen, coffee cups warming hands while conversations drift lazily around the living room. The topic that day, as it had been many times before, was my grandparents' house. It had been sitting empty for several months after my grandmother passed away. An old 2-story home with wide wooden floors, tall windows, and a deep front porch that creaked softly when you walked across it. To the rest of the family, the house was an asset. To me, it was something else entirely. I had spent years there helping my grandmother manage daily life. I knew every drawer, every cabinet, every folder where she kept important papers. But during that conversation, no one asked about those details. They were discussing bigger ideas. Selling it, renovating it, turning it into a rental property. My cousin Mark leaned back in his chair and said confidently, "We should probably sell it while the market's still strong." My brother Daniel nodded. "Yeah, houses like that are expensive to maintain." Several people murmured in agreement. I was sitting at the far end of the couch, listening, not because I felt excluded, but because I had already noticed something about the conversation that made speaking unnecessary. They were discussing the house as if it were a shared decision, as if the family collectively owned it, which, legally speaking, wasn't quite accurate. But I didn't say that. Instead, I waited to see if anyone would ask a simple question. Something like, "Who actually holds the title?" No one did. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes before my Uncle Robert finally turned toward me, not with curiosity, with convenience. "Mia," he said casually, "you probably have the paperwork somewhere. Do you know if the property taxes are up to date?" It was a practical question, and everyone in the room turned slightly, waiting for the answer. I nodded. Yes, they're current. That was the truth. I had paid them myself 3 weeks earlier. Robert smiled in that quick, satisfied way people do when a problem has been confirmed as solved. "Good," he said, turning back to the group. "At least we don't have to worry about that." And then the conversation moved on. Back to renovation costs. Back to market timing. Back to opinions about what we should do. That was the small cut, not the question. The assumption behind it. In that moment, I wasn't someone whose opinion shaped the decision. I was simply the person who ensured the system kept functioning while decisions were made elsewhere. It was subtle. No one interrupted me. No one dismissed me directly. But something about the rhythm of the conversation had become very clear. They believed they understood the situation. And more importantly, they believed they understood my place in it. I remember standing later that afternoon in the quiet kitchen while rinsing a coffee mug in the sink. Through the doorway, I could hear the rest of them still talking in the living room. Their voices carried that easy confidence people have when they think the structure of a situation is obvious. But inside my mind, a different thought had already formed. Not angry, not defensive, just precise. They weren't asking the right question. And because they weren't asking it, No one had noticed the answer sitting quietly in the background. That was the moment I realized something important. Disrespect doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in assumptions. And assumptions have a strange habit. The longer they go unchallenged, the more permanent they begin to feel. But this was only the first time I noticed it clearly. Over the next few months, that same pattern would repeat. Small dismissals, casual decisions, conversations where my presence was useful but never central. And slowly, almost without realizing it, everyone in the family began accepting a version of reality that wasn't entirely true, including me, at least for a while. After that Sunday afternoon, life continued in the familiar rhythm our family had always followed. Group messages about holidays, occasional phone calls about practical matters, the quiet, steady flow of responsibilities that seemed to land naturally in my hands. At first, nothing felt dramatically different, but once you notice a pattern, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it. And the pattern surrounding the house began appearing in small, almost forgettable moments. One evening, my brother Daniel called me while I was finishing paperwork at my dining table. "Hey," he said casually. "Mark and I were talking earlier about the house." I waited. "We're thinking it might need a contractor to look at the roof," he continued. "Do you think you could set that up?" Again, the request itself wasn't unreasonable. I had always been the one who arranged practical things. But something about the wording caught my attention. "We're thinking," not "what do you think?" Just the quiet assumption that the decision had already been made somewhere else. And my role was simply to facilitate it. I told him I would call someone the next morning. And I did. 2 weeks later, the contractor walked through the house, checked the attic beams, and confirmed what I already suspected. The roof was aging, but it wasn't urgent. I sent the written report to Daniel and Mark in a shared email. Their reply came quickly. "Thanks, Mia. Good to know." No follow-up discussion, no deeper conversation, just the quiet continuation of the same structure. Over the next few months, that rhythm repeated again and again. Mark would message me asking if I could check something at the house. Daniel would ask if I had any idea how much utilities were costing. My Uncle Robert occasionally asked if I could dig up certain documents. Each request was practical. Each request assumed the same thing, that I was the person closest to the information, but somehow still outside the decisions. And the truth is, for a long time, I accepted it, not because I felt powerless, but because part of me believed maintaining harmony mattered more than correcting small misunderstandings. Families develop unspoken agreements over time, roles that keep things running smoothly. Mine had always been the one who absorbed complexity quietly, so everyone else could focus on the bigger picture. At least, that's how I justified it. But there was one moment, late one evening, that made me pause. I was sitting at the desk in the small study of my grandparents' house. The room still smelled faintly of the cedar polish my grandmother used on the bookshelves. In front of me sat a stack of folders containing property records, insurance policies, and maintenance receipts. I had been organizing them, something I had done dozens of times before, but this time my attention lingered on a single document longer than usual: the property deed. The page was simple, clean, legally precise. My name printed clearly where the owner's name belonged. I had seen that document many times before. After my grandfather passed away, the house had been transferred into my name through a structure inside the trust. My grandmother had insisted on it. At the time, the explanation had been straightforward. "You're the one who actually takes care of things," she had said softly at the kitchen table. "It's easier this way." There had been nothing dramatic about it. Just a practical decision made by someone who understood how families function. But sitting there in the quiet study that evening, I realized something that had never fully registered before. The rest of the family had never asked to see the deed. Not once. They had simply assumed the house existed inside the same shared category as every other family asset. And because no one questioned that assumption, it had quietly solidified into their version of reality. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the soft creak of the wooden floor as the house settled around me. For the first time, a thought surfaced that felt slightly uncomfortable. Not anger, not resentment, just awareness. They weren't intentionally dismissing me. Most of them genuinely believed they were including me in the process. But they were including me in the role they had already assigned. The reliable one, the organized one, the one who handles details, not the one who determines outcomes. And I began to wonder something simple. What would happen if I stopped correcting their assumptions? Not out of spite, just out of curiosity. Because sometimes the clearest way to understand a situation is to let it continue exactly as people believe it already works. There's a strange moment that happens in many families. It's not dramatic, no one announces it, but at some point, everyone quietly agrees, without ever saying it out loud, who each person is supposed to be. The responsible one, The loud one, the difficult one, the successful one. And once those identities settle into place, they tend to stay there for years. By the time we reached the months after my grandmother passed away, my role in the family had already been firmly decided. I was the reliable one, the person who handled things that required patience, the one who made problems disappear quietly before they reached anyone else. It sounds flattering when you say it that way, but the hidden part of that role is something people rarely talk about. Reliable people are often expected to function without needing recognition. And slowly that expectation had shaped how everyone interacted with me. One evening, I noticed it clearly during a group call with my brother Daniel, my cousin Mark, and my uncle Robert. The conversation had started casually enough, talking about the house again, as we had many times before. Robert was explaining his thoughts about possibly renovating the kitchen before putting the house on the market. Mark jumped in with ideas about contractors he knew. Daniel talked about real estate timing and property values. For almost 15 minutes, they discussed renovation plans, cabinets, flooring, potential resale value. Eventually, Daniel paused and said, "Mia, you're quiet. What do you think?" It sounded like inclusion. But by that point, the conversation had already reached its conclusion. The decisions were already forming. They weren't asking for direction. They were asking for confirmation. I glanced at the notepad sitting beside me on the table. During the call, I had been writing down numbers. Estimated renovation costs, recent comparable home sales, property tax projections, not guesses, actual numbers. Because over the past few months, I had quietly been studying the market surrounding that neighborhood. Not intentionally for this moment, just because I like understanding systems before decisions are made. If I had spoken then, I could have explained something important. That renovating the house before selling it would likely cost far more than the value it added. That the structure of the property made certain upgrades inefficient. That there were legal considerations they hadn't even mentioned yet. But instead I simply said, I think it's worth thinking carefully before starting major renovations. There was a short silence. Then Mark laughed lightly. Yeah, Mia's always the cautious one. Robert chuckled. Well, that's why we have her keeping us grounded. The conversation moved on, and something about that moment stayed with me long after the call ended, because their reaction revealed something deeper than disagreement. It revealed how they interpreted my voice, not as authority, not as information, but as balance, a stabilizing presence that existed to support the direction already chosen. Later that night, I found myself walking slowly through the hallway of my grandparents' house. The wooden floors creaked softly under my steps. The house was quiet in the way older homes often are, holding echoes of the lives that had passed through it. I paused at the small table near the front door where my grandmother used to keep her keys. The surface was empty now, but the memory of those keys remained clear in my mind. She had always kept them in the same place, not because she feared losing them, but because she understood something about order. When things have a clear place, they rarely disappear. Standing there, I realized something subtle about the role my family had assigned to me. They believed I existed inside the system, someone who helped keep things running smoothly. But they had never stopped to ask a more fundamental question. Who actually designed that system? Because sometimes the person quietly organizing everything in the background is also the person who understands it best. And once you understand a system completely, you begin to see something others don't. You see where the real control exists, not in the loud conversations, not in the confident opinions, but in the quiet structures no one else is paying attention to. At that moment, I still hadn't decided to change anything, but a new awareness had begun to form. The role they had assigned to me was useful, comfortable, predictable, and because it had existed for so long, everyone assumed it would continue forever, including them. What none of us realized yet was that something inside me had already begun to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to make me start asking a quiet question. What would happen if I stopped playing the role exactly the way they expected? The moment things changed didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic declaration that I had reached my limit. In fact, the shift happened on a morning that looked completely ordinary. It was early autumn in Portland, the kind of morning where the air feels cool, but the sunlight still falls warmly through the trees. I had driven over to my grandparents' house to check the mail and open a few windows. Old houses don't like being closed up for too long. They need air, movement, quiet care. When I unlocked the front door, the familiar scent of cedar and old books greeted me. For a moment, I simply stood there. This had been my grandmother's favorite time of day. She used to sit by the front window with her tea, watching people walk their dogs down the street. I walked through the house slowly, opening curtains and letting the light move into the rooms. Everything looked exactly the way it always had, but something about that morning felt different. Not outside, inside. I carried a small stack of mail to the kitchen table and began sorting through it. Utility bills, advertisements, a property tax notice that I had already paid weeks earlier. While placing the envelopes into organized piles, my eyes drifted toward the hallway leading to the study. That was where the property documents were kept. I hadn't planned to review them that day. I had seen those papers many times before, but something about the quiet of the house drew me there anyway. The study door creaked softly as I pushed it open. Dust particles floated in the sunlight coming through the tall window, drifting slowly in the still air. I sat down at the desk and opened the familiar folder. The deed, the trust paperwork, insurance records, the same documents that had always been there. Nothing had changed. But this time, instead of reading them as tasks to manage, I read them with a different awareness. Each line of legal language felt more concrete, more final. The ownership structure was clear. There was no ambiguity. The house belonged to me, not shared, not temporary, not something that required approval from anyone else, just mine. For several minutes, I sat quietly, letting that reality settle in a way it never had before, not as a technical detail, as a truth. And suddenly something about the previous months replayed in my mind. The conversations, the confident planning, the discussions about renovations, contractors, selling timelines. All of it had happened with the assumption that the house was a family asset, something everyone could weigh in on equally. But legally, that assumption had never been accurate. I thought back to my grandmother sitting at the same desk years earlier. She had slid the paperwork across the table to me with a calm expression. "You're the one who understands how to keep things steady," she had said. At the time, I believed she simply wanted the paperwork handled efficiently. But sitting there now, I wondered if she had seen something deeper. Maybe she had understood how easily responsibility gets separated from authority inside families. How often the quiet, reliable person ends up carrying the weight while others make the decisions. And maybe, just maybe, she had decided to balance that equation before it ever became a problem. I closed the folder slowly. For the first time, the conversations happening within the family didn't feel frustrating. They felt revealing. Everyone believed they understood the structure of the situation, but the structure they believed in wasn't the real one. And suddenly, a different way of thinking began forming in my mind. Not confrontation, not correction, just patience. Because when people believe a story about how power works in a room, they rarely question it until reality quietly interrupts. I stood up and walked back into the hallway. Near the front door sat the small wooden table where my grandmother used to keep her keys. A simple brass keyring rested there now. I picked it up, turning it gently in my hand. The metal felt cool against my fingers. For years, I had thought of those keys as a symbol of responsibility, taking care of the house, maintaining the property, handling the details. But that morning, I understood something new. Keys don't just represent responsibility. They represent authority, and sometimes the person holding them is the last one to realize what that actually means. I placed the keys back on the table and stepped outside into the crisp autumn air. Nothing about the world had changed, but something inside me had shifted quietly into place. Not anger, not resentment, just clarity. And clarity has a way of changing how silence feels. Before that morning, silence had been something I used to avoid conflict. After that morning, silence became a choice. Before that morning in the study, my silence had always come from habit. I stayed quiet because it felt easier, because families function more smoothly when someone absorbs tension instead of pushing against it. But after I understood the full reality of the situation, the house, the documents, the legal structure, my silence started to feel different. It wasn't passive anymore. It was deliberate. And the interesting thing about deliberate silence is that other people almost always misunderstand it. Over the next few weeks, the same conversations continued. Group texts about the house, calls about maintenance, occasional suggestions about selling timelines. But something subtle had changed inside me. Instead of feeling slightly uneasy during those conversations, I began listening with a different perspective. Like watching a chessboard where the other players hadn't realized the rules were slightly different than they thought. One evening, my cousin Mark called again. "Mia, quick question," he said. "Daniel and I were thinking about having a real estate agent come by to give us an estimate on the property." There it was again. Us, not unkind, just assumed. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window as evening light faded across the street. "An estimate for selling?" I asked calmly. "Yeah," Mark replied, "just to see what we're working with." "Working with?" I could hear the confidence in his voice, the easy certainty of someone who believed the structure of the situation was obvious. And technically, there was nothing wrong with the idea itself. Getting a property estimate was a practical step, but I noticed something about the way the request was framed. They weren't asking if the house should be evaluated. They were asking when I could arrange it. The familiar pattern again. Decision first. Logistics handled by me. For a moment, I considered saying something. Something simple like, before we move forward, we should probably clarify ownership. It would have taken less than 10 seconds. A small correction. A quick adjustment to everyone's understanding. But instead I paused, not out of hesitation, out of curiosity, because part of me wanted to see how far the assumption would carry itself without intervention. So I answered the same way I had many times before. I can call an agent and schedule a walkthrough. Mark sounded relieved. Perfect. I knew you'd know how to handle it. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment. The interesting thing about silence is that people often interpret it through the lens of their own expectations. If someone already believes you're passive, your silence reinforces that belief. If someone believes you're uncertain, your silence feels like hesitation. But silence can also be something else entirely. It can be observation. It can be patience. Or sometimes, it can simply be the decision not to interrupt someone else's assumptions. A few days later, the real estate agent walked through the house with me. She was a thoughtful woman named Karen, who had been selling properties in the neighborhood for nearly 20 years. We moved slowly from room to room as she made notes on a tablet. When we reached the kitchen, she paused. "This house has incredible bones," she said. "Homes like this are getting rare around here." I nodded. "It's been well maintained." She looked at me with a small smile. "You've taken good care of it." I didn't correct her, because that part was true. Near the end of the visit, she asked a question that no one in my family had asked in months. "So," she said casually, "are you planning to sell soon?" Not "are you all planning," just you. For a brief moment, I studied her expression. Real estate agents have a habit of sensing ownership structures very quickly. The way people speak, the way they move through a property, the way decisions are framed. They notice things others overlook. "I'm still considering options," I said. Karen nodded. "Well, whenever you decide, this property will attract attention." Before leaving, she handed me a printed valuation estimate. I thanked her and walked her to the front door. After she left, I stood on the porch for a moment, looking out over the quiet street. Inside the house, the rooms felt calm, steady, exactly the way they always had. But beyond those walls, something else was unfolding quietly. My family still believed they were gradually moving toward a collective decision about the property. They believed the system worked the way it always had, that discussions would lead to agreements, that agreements would lead to action, and that I would continue handling the details along the way. What they didn't realize yet was that the most important detail had never actually been part of their conversations. Not because I had hidden it, but because no one had thought to ask. And the longer that silence continued, the more revealing their assumptions became. There's a quiet advantage to being underestimated. When people assume you're simply maintaining things instead of shaping them, they rarely watch your movements closely. And over the months that followed, that lack of attention created space. Space to observe, space to learn, space to prepare, without anyone realizing preparation was happening. From the outside, my behavior didn't change much. I still answered calls. I still handled practical details when someone asked. If Mark needed information about property taxes, I sent it. If Daniel asked about insurance coverage, I provided the documents. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. But behind those small tasks, something else was slowly unfolding. The first thing I did was something simple. I started documenting everything. Not dramatically, just carefully. Every conversation about the house, every suggestion about selling it, every message where someone spoke as if the decision belonged to everyone. Dates, times, exact wording, not because I expected conflict, but because clarity becomes powerful when situations grow complicated. Most families operate on memory, and memory has a habit of bending itself around whatever people wish had happened. Written records don't do that. They simply wait. The second thing I did was deepen my understanding of the property itself. Even though I had already managed the house for years, I wanted a complete picture. I reviewed zoning regulations for the neighborhood, looked at city planning proposals, studied recent property sales within a 1-mile radius. Not just the prices, but the patterns. Which homes sold fastest? Which renovations actually increased value? Which ones wasted money? The more I researched, the clearer something became. The house had far more potential than anyone in my family realized. Not because it needed renovation, but because of its location. A new transit development had been quietly approved 2 streets away. Once completed, the surrounding properties would likely increase in value significantly. Most people hadn't noticed yet. The city planning documents were buried inside long municipal reports few people ever read. But the pattern was there. And once you see patterns like that, you start understanding timing differently. Meanwhile, the conversations in the family continued along their familiar path. Renovation ideas, selling timelines, occasional debates about which real estate agency might handle the listing. None of them knew about the transit development. None of them had studied the market the way I had. And none of them realized that every conversation they were having was based on incomplete information. One evening, Daniel called again. "We were thinking spring might be a good time to list the house," he said. Spring? 6 months away. Exactly when the transit project announcement was scheduled to become public. I listened quietly as he explained his reasoning. Strong market activity. Families moving before the next school year. His arguments made sense, based on the information he had. When he finished, he asked, "What do you think?" It was the same question he had asked before. The same kind of moment where my voice was expected to offer gentle caution, but not direction. This time I answered carefully. "I think timing matters more than people realize." Daniel chuckled lightly. "You're always thinking 3 steps ahead." He meant it as a compliment, but the truth behind his sentence was deeper than he realized. I was thinking several steps ahead, just not in the way he imagined. After the call ended, I opened my laptop and reviewed the municipal development timeline again. Construction announcements, infrastructure funding approvals, projected completion phases, everything aligned with the same window. The property value would likely shift significantly once the project became public knowledge. Waiting could change everything, but more important than the financial aspect was something else I had begun to understand. My family believed decisions about the house would eventually be settled through group discussion. But the legal reality made something very different possible. At any moment, I could choose a direction, not because I wanted to control the situation, but because the structure of ownership gave me that authority. Still, I didn't act yet. Preparation doesn't always mean immediate movement. Sometimes it simply means understanding the landscape before anyone else realizes the ground is shifting. Over the following weeks, I continued gathering information quietly. Property records, local development plans, financial projections. Each piece of knowledge added another layer of clarity. And all the while, the family continued discussing the house as if it existed inside a shared decision-making process. They didn't notice the research. They didn't notice the documentation. They didn't notice the careful way I had begun positioning myself to make a decision that no one else was expecting. Not because they weren't intelligent, but because their attention was focused somewhere else, on the conversations, on the opinions, on the assumption that the person managing the details wasn't also shaping the outcome. And sometimes the most powerful position in any situation is the one no one realizes you're standing in. Preparation changes the way you see information. When you begin studying a situation closely, small details that once seemed ordinary start revealing patterns. And sometimes those patterns lead you to something unexpected. For me, that discovery happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I had scheduled time to review a few additional city planning documents related to the transit project I had been tracking. Most of the reports were dense. Pages of infrastructure diagrams, funding allocations, and development timelines. The kind of documents most people skim once, then forget. But as I read through one section about future zoning adjustments, something caught my attention. A proposed mixed-use development corridor, 2 streets from my grandparents' house. The city was planning to adjust zoning restrictions in that area to allow small commercial spaces on corner properties, coffee shops, boutiques, local offices, nothing massive. But changes like that tend to shift property values dramatically, especially for older homes sitting on larger lots. I opened a map and traced the boundary lines carefully. The corridor extended almost exactly to the edge of our block, which meant the house sat inside a neighborhood about to become far more desirable than it currently appeared. I leaned back in my chair, letting that realization settle, because suddenly the conversations my family had been having about the property felt incomplete in a very different way. They weren't just discussing the house without understanding ownership. They were also discussing it without understanding its future value. Selling quickly, something they had mentioned several times, would likely mean walking away from a significant increase in potential worth. Not immediately, but soon. Still, I didn't feel excited. That was the strange part. Most people, when discovering financial leverage, feel a rush of energy. But what I felt instead was clarity, calm, like a puzzle piece sliding quietly into place. I printed a copy of the zoning proposal and placed it beside the valuation estimate the real estate agent had given me weeks earlier. The 2 documents told very different stories. The first showed the house's current market value. The second hinted at what that value might become once the neighborhood evolved. And sitting between those 2 realities was something only I currently understood. Not because I was hiding it, but because I had taken the time to look. That evening, I drove over to the house again. The sun was setting as I unlocked the front door, casting long golden shadows across the wooden floors. I walked slowly through each room. The living room where my grandparents had hosted holiday dinners. The kitchen where my grandmother used to hum softly while cooking. The small study where the documents were stored. This house had always felt steady, But now it felt something else too, like a quiet center point in a situation everyone else believed they understood. I sat down at the study desk again and opened the folder containing the deed. My name stared back at me from the page. Simple. Final. For years, that document had felt like responsibility. Now it felt like something slightly different. Freedom, not the kind that comes from winning an argument, but the kind that comes from knowing the final decision belongs to you. I thought about my family, Daniel with his practical thinking, Mark with his confident opinions, Uncle Robert with his steady belief that important matters were best handled in small meetings between certain people. None of them were bad people. None of them were trying to exclude me deliberately. They were simply operating inside a story they had always believed about how authority moved through the family. And the truth is, that story had worked for a long time. But the house had quietly shifted the structure of that story, without anyone noticing, including me, until now. I closed the folder and looked toward the window as evening darkness began settling outside. At that moment, the situation felt surprisingly simple. The family believed the future of the house would eventually be decided through discussion, through meetings, through collective agreement, but legally that wasn't necessary. The choice could be made quietly, at any time, and that realization created a new kind of question in my mind. Not what should I do, but when should I decide? Because once a decision like that is made, the entire structure of expectations around it changes. Conversations shift, assumptions break apart, and the people who believed they were shaping the outcome suddenly realize something different had been happening all along. The room grows quiet in a very particular way when that moment arrives. Not angry, just surprised. And I began to understand that moment was getting closer. Once you understand a situation clearly, something interesting happens. The question is no longer what's possible. The question becomes which path you're willing to live with afterward. Over the next several days, I found myself thinking carefully about the options in front of me. Not emotionally, practically. Because when you hold legal authority over something significant, like a house that has been part of a family for decades, every choice carries consequences that extend far beyond paperwork. The first option was the simplest. Tell everyone immediately. Explain the ownership structure. Show them the deed. Correct the misunderstanding before it moved any further. It would have been quick, direct, probably uncomfortable for a few minutes, but ultimately straightforward. But when I imagined that conversation, something about it felt incomplete. Not wrong, just rushed, because the deeper issue wasn't the paperwork. The deeper issue was the assumptions that had grown quietly around the situation. If I interrupted those assumptions too early, the conversation would likely turn into something defensive. People explaining what they meant, people insisting they had never intended to exclude me. The real dynamics underneath everything would remain mostly untouched. The second option was more passive. Do nothing. Let the family continue discussing the house until eventually someone asked the obvious legal question. Eventually, someone would check the deed. Eventually, the truth would surface on its own. But that approach had a different problem. It meant surrendering control of the timing. And timing, I had learned through months of observation, was often the most important factor in any decision, especially when property values were about to change, which led to the third option, the one that felt the most irreversible. Make the decision myself, quietly, before the next family discussion ever happened. Not out of secrecy, not out of revenge, simply because the structure of ownership allowed it. I spent a long evening at my dining table reviewing the numbers again. The current market valuation, projected property increases once the transit project became public, estimated tax implications, maintenance costs, everything lined up with the same conclusion. The smartest decision wasn't selling quickly, and it wasn't renovating. The smartest decision was holding the property exactly as it was for at least another year. Let the neighborhood shift. Let the infrastructure announcement happen. Let the market adjust. But making that decision would require something specific. It meant formalizing my position as the sole decision-maker regarding the house. Legally, that was already true, but legally documenting future property strategy would remove any remaining ambiguity. Once it was done, there would be no meeting where someone could vote on selling, no conversation where someone could assume collective authority, just the quiet reality of an established plan. I sat there for a long time, looking at the documents spread across the table. This wasn't about proving a point. It wasn't about correcting anyone's behavior. It was simply about choosing a direction. And the truth was, my grandmother had already trusted me with that responsibility years earlier. Perhaps she had anticipated exactly this moment. Finally, I closed the laptop and gathered the papers into a neat stack. Decision made. The next morning, I called a property attorney I had worked with professionally in the past. His name was Andrew, calm, precise, the kind of lawyer who preferred clarity over drama. When he answered the phone, I explained the situation simply. I'd like to formalize a long-term holding plan for a residential property I own, I said. There was a brief pause while he typed notes. That's straightforward, he replied. We can structure that fairly easily. Do you currently hold the deed individually or through a trust? Individually, I said. Even simpler. He explained the paperwork required. A property management framework. A long-term holding strategy. Clear documentation establishing that the property would remain under my direct control and would not be listed for sale without my authorization. All completely legal, all completely ordinary, the kind of process people completed every day. But in this case, the outcome would quietly change something my family hadn't realized was still open for discussion. Before ending the call, Andrew asked a routine question. Is there any urgency around this? I thought for a moment. Not urgency, just timing. I'd like to have everything finalized within the next few weeks, I said. That's no problem, he replied. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment. Outside, the city moved through another ordinary day. Traffic passing, people walking down the street, nothing unusual. But somewhere in the background of those normal sounds, something subtle had shifted. Because a decision had been made, and once certain decisions are made, everything that follows becomes much simpler. Not louder, just clearer. Once a decision becomes clear in your mind, the actions that follow tend to feel surprisingly calm. Not dramatic, not emotional, just a series of practical steps that quietly turn intention into reality. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with Andrew to finalize the property framework we had discussed. Most of it involved paperwork, documents that clarified the long-term management structure of the house. The plan was simple. The property would remain under my direct ownership. A formal management strategy would outline maintenance, tax handling, and long-term holding intentions. And any future sale would require my explicit authorization. Nothing unusual. In fact, arrangements like that happen every day in real estate. But what made this situation different was the timing. My family still believed the house was moving toward a shared decision about selling. Meanwhile, the legal structure around the property was quietly becoming more defined than it had ever been. Andrew scheduled a short meeting at his office to review the final documents. His office sat on the 3rd floor of an older brick building downtown, overlooking a narrow street filled with small cafes. The kind of quiet professional environment where important decisions are often finalized without much ceremony. When I arrived, he had already placed the documents neatly across the conference table. He walked me through each section carefully. Ownership confirmation, management authority, long-term holding strategy. Each paragraph written in clear, precise legal language. By the time we reached the final page, the structure of everything was unmistakable. Once the documents were signed and filed, there would be no ambiguity left about how decisions regarding the house would be made. Andrew set down his pen and looked at me calmly. Everything here reflects what you described, he said. Are you comfortable moving forward? I glanced through the pages one more time, not because I had doubts, just because moments like this deserve a final pause. This house had been part of my family's life for decades. Memories lived inside those walls. Holiday dinners, quiet mornings with my grandmother, years of small, ordinary moments that had shaped the person I had become. But ownership carries responsibility too. And responsibility sometimes requires clarity where others prefer assumptions. I'm comfortable, I said. He nodded and slid the pen across the table. Signing the documents took less than a minute. A simple motion of ink across paper. Yet that small act quietly finalized something my family didn't realize had been undecided. Andrew gathered the paperwork and organized it into a folder. I'll have these filed by the end of the week, he said. That's perfect. Before I left, he asked one last question. Will the property remain a personal residence or an investment hold? I thought for a moment. Both, I said. The house would remain exactly as it was. Maintained. Protected. Allowed to grow in value while the neighborhood around it slowly changed. No rush, no renovation chaos. Just patience. Andrew nodded. That's often the best strategy with properties like this. When I stepped back onto the street outside his office, the afternoon air felt crisp and clear. People walked past carrying coffee cups, talking on phones, moving through their normal routines. Nothing about the city looked different, but somewhere in the quiet background of those ordinary moments, something had shifted permanently. The house was no longer part of an open family discussion. The decision had already been made. Not loudly, not dramatically, just legally. Over the following days, life continued normally. Group messages appeared occasionally. Mark asked if the real estate agent had sent the valuation report. Daniel mentioned he wanted to revisit the selling timeline soon. I answered politely, shared the information they requested, maintained the same calm tone I had always used. From their perspective, nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, the structure of the situation had quietly closed. The door they believed was still open. was already locked. And the interesting thing about moments like that is what happens next. Because eventually, someone decides it's time to have the meeting. The meeting where final decisions are supposed to happen, where everyone gathers in one room, where opinions are shared, where people assume they're about to shape the outcome. In our family, that meeting was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon. At the house, the same house where the decision had already been made weeks earlier. And that was the moment everything they believed about the situation finally began to collide with reality. The message about the meeting appeared in our family group chat on a Wednesday evening. It came from my Uncle Robert. "Let's all meet at the house this Sunday afternoon. We should finally decide what we're doing with the property." The wording was calm, reasonable, exactly the kind of message that would normally lead to a familiar kind of gathering. Coffee cups on the table, everyone sharing opinions, the slow process of reaching a group decision. I read the message twice. Then I simply replied, "Sunday works for me. Nothing more." Over the next few days, a few additional messages followed. Mark suggested inviting the real estate agent to speak about the valuation. Daniel mentioned he had looked into renovation costs. Robert said he would bring some notes about market timing. The tone was organized, productive. Everyone sounded confident that Sunday would finally bring clarity. And in a way, they were right. Sunday arrived with quiet autumn sunlight filtering through the maple trees outside the house. I arrived early, unlocking the front door and stepping inside. The house felt calm, the same gentle stillness it always carried when empty. I walked through the room slowly, opening the curtains and letting light fill the living room. The wooden floors creaked softly beneath my steps. For a moment, I stood in the kitchen, remembering my grandmother standing at the stove years earlier, humming softly while stirring a pot of soup. She had always believed homes should feel steady, not rushed, not chaotic, just quietly cared for. I placed a kettle on the stove and set out a few coffee cups on the counter. Soon after, the doorbell rang. Mark arrived first, carrying a folder filled with printed market reports. Daniel followed a few minutes later, holding a notebook. Then my Uncle Robert arrived with the calm seriousness he always carried into conversations about important matters. Everyone greeted each other warmly. There was no tension, no hint that anything unusual was about to happen. We gathered in the living room where sunlight streamed through the tall front windows. Mark spread his papers across the coffee table. Daniel leaned back in one of the chairs. Robert cleared his throat slightly, the way he often did before guiding a conversation. "Well," he said, looking around the room, "I think it's time we finally decide what direction we want to take with the house." Everyone nodded. Mark began explaining the valuation numbers. Daniel shared his thoughts about the renovation estimates. Robert spoke about market timing again. For several minutes, the conversation moved exactly the way they expected it to. Organized, thoughtful, confident. From the outside, it looked like a group of people calmly working toward a shared decision. And I listened, just as I always had. Occasionally, someone glanced toward me, expecting the familiar kind of input I had always offered. Small clarifications, practical details. But something interesting began happening as the conversation continued. Their ideas started running into small obstacles. Mark mentioned listing the property quickly. Daniel pointed out renovation costs might delay that plan. Robert suggested waiting until spring. Mark worried the market might change. Each proposal created new complications. Each complication led to more discussion. Gradually, the confidence in the room shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough to create small pauses between sentences. The kind of pauses that happen when people begin realizing a situation may be more complicated than they first believed. Eventually, Mark leaned back and rubbed his forehead. "So what do we actually want to do here?" he asked. The room grew quiet for a moment, and that was when Robert spoke again. "We should probably hold a smaller discussion first," he said thoughtfully. He glanced toward Daniel and Mark. "Maybe the three of us step into the study and sort through the options before we bring Mia into the final decision." The words were spoken gently, not dismissively, just automatically, as if the structure of the conversation had already been decided somewhere in the background. Mark nodded. Daniel hesitated slightly but didn't object. And then Robert turned toward me with a polite expression. "Mia, maybe it's easier if you stay out here for a few minutes while we go over the numbers." There it was. The sentence, simple, calm, completely expected by everyone else in the room. The door to the study was only a few steps away, and they stood up, gathering their papers, preparing to continue the important part of the conversation privately. None of them noticed the small brass keyring resting quietly on the table near the front door. None of them realized that the meeting they believed they were about to have was already unnecessary, because the house where they were closing that door belonged to me. For a moment, no one moved. Robert's sentence hung in the room the way polite instructions often do, quietly confident that everyone will simply follow along. Mark had already gathered his papers. Daniel stood halfway between the coffee table and the hallway. The study door waited a few steps away. It was all very normal, the kind of moment that had probably happened dozens of times in our family over the years. A small group stepping aside to sort things out, while someone else waited politely for the final decision. And for a second, I almost followed the familiar script. But something about the calmness of the room made me pause, not out of defiance, just clarity. I picked up the kettle from the kitchen counter and poured hot water into the coffee cups I had set out earlier. Steam rose slowly into the sunlight. The quiet sound of pouring water made everyone glance toward me again. Mark smiled slightly. "We won't be long," he said. "Just want to run through a few numbers." I nodded. Of course. My voice was calm, exactly the way it always was. They began walking toward the hallway, Robert in front, Mark behind him, Daniel lingering slightly at the back. Then I said something simple. "Before you start, there's something you should probably know." It wasn't loud, just enough to stop their steps. Robert turned first. "What's that?" he asked. I placed the kettle down gently on the counter and walked a few steps closer to the living room. The sunlight through the windows made the room feel almost unusually bright. "I've already made the decision about the house," I said. For a second, the sentence didn't seem to register. Mark blinked. Daniel frowned slightly. Robert tilted his head in quiet confusion. "What do you mean?" Mark asked. I walked over to the small table near the front door where the brass keyring rested. The keys made a soft metallic sound as I picked them up. "About 2 weeks ago," I said calmly, "I finalized a long-term management plan for the property." The room became very still. Robert's brow tightened slightly. "A management plan?" he repeated. "Yes." I met his gaze evenly. "The house won't be listed for sale right now. I've decided to hold it." Another small silence followed. Mark looked from Robert to Daniel. Daniel's expression had shifted into something more focused now. "Mia," he said slowly, "we were all supposed to decide that together." There was no anger in his voice yet, just confusion. And underneath that confusion was the first hint of something else. Realization. I nodded gently. "I understand why you thought that." Mark's voice came next, a little sharper. "Wait, what do you mean you've already decided?" I didn't rush the answer. "Because moments like this move best at their own pace. The property belongs to me," I said. 3 seconds of silence. Then 5. You could almost hear the structure of their assumptions beginning to shift. Robert spoke first. "I thought the house was part of the family trust." "It was," I said, "until it transferred to my name after Grandpa passed away." Mark's eyes widened slightly. Daniel looked at me more carefully now. "You're saying you own it?" "Yes." The word landed quietly, but its effects spread through the room immediately. Mark slowly lowered the folder he was holding. Robert's confident posture softened as if he were replaying months of conversations in his mind. Daniel exhaled slowly and rubbed his hand across his jaw. None of them spoke for several seconds, because the realization arriving in that moment wasn't just about ownership. It was about timing, the discussions, the renovation debates, the valuation reports, the meeting they had just organized. All of it had been built around a structure that no longer existed. And more importantly, the decision they believed they were about to make had already been made weeks earlier. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "You didn't think to mention that before." His tone wasn't angry yet, just stunned. I considered the question for a moment. Then I answered honestly. "No one ever asked." That sentence settled into the room in a way none of the others had. Because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't accusing. It was simply true. And truth has a way of making people rethink the path that led them to a moment. Daniel sat down slowly in the chair he had just stood up from. Robert looked toward the study door for a moment before glancing back at me. The meeting they had planned to have in that room no longer had a purpose, because the decision they thought was still open was already closed. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after my last sentence. Not tense, just still. It's a particular kind of silence that appears when people realize the structure of a situation is different from what they believed. No one raised their voice. No one argued. Instead, everyone seemed to be recalculating the last several months of conversations. Mark was the first to move. He sat back down slowly, placing his folder on the coffee table, as if the papers inside it had suddenly lost their purpose. Daniel leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees, looking at the floor for a few seconds before finally glancing up at me again. Robert remained standing, though the confident posture he had carried earlier had softened into something more thoughtful. "So," Daniel said quietly, "the house is entirely in your name." "Yes, and the plan to hold the property," he continued, "that's already been finalized legally?" "Yes." There was no reason to complicate the answers. Mark exhaled through his nose, not quite a laugh. "Well," he said, "that definitely changes the meeting." Robert slowly walked back toward the living room and sat down in the armchair near the window. The sunlight had shifted slightly now, casting softer shadows across the wooden floor. For the first time that afternoon, He spoke without the tone of someone guiding the conversation. I suppose we misunderstood the situation, he said. The words weren't defensive. Just careful. I nodded. I think the structure was never really discussed. Mark rubbed his hands together slowly. I guess we all assumed it was still part of the family trust. That would make sense, I said. Daniel looked toward the hallway where the study door still stood slightly open. A few minutes earlier, that room had been the place where they expected the real decisions to happen. Now it felt almost unnecessary. So what's the plan? He asked calmly. The house stays exactly as it is for now, I replied. I explained the reasoning simply. The neighborhood development, the transit project, the projected increase in property value once the city announcements became public. No dramatic presentation, just the information I had already studied. Mark listened quietly. Daniel nodded slowly as the details connected. Robert folded his hands together in his lap. When I finished, another small silence settled into the room. This one felt different, less confused, more reflective. Finally, Daniel spoke again. That actually makes a lot of sense, he said. Mark looked at him, then back at me. Yeah, he admitted. If the development happens the way you're describing, selling now would be way too early. Robert leaned back slightly in the chair. You've clearly thought this through. I had time, I said gently. The sentence carried no edge, just honesty. For the first time that afternoon, the conversation had shifted into something balanced. Not because anyone had lost face, but because the underlying structure had become visible. Robert glanced toward the small table near the front door, where the brass keyring had been resting earlier. Then his eyes returned to me. Well, he said calmly, it seems the house is in capable hands. The statement wasn't dramatic, but it carried a quiet kind of recognition, not of authority, of responsibility. And sometimes those two things look almost the same when handled calmly. Mark gathered his papers slowly, though now he seemed more amused than frustrated. Guess we should have checked the deed first, he said with a half smile. Daniel chuckled lightly. Probably would have saved us a few meetings. The tension that might have existed in another family never quite arrived here. Because the situation hadn't been about confrontation. It had simply been about clarity. And clarity rarely needs raised voices to make itself understood. After a few more minutes, the conversation drifted into more ordinary topics. Maintenance schedules, property taxes, future possibilities once the neighborhood changed. But the dynamic had shifted. Subtly, the study door remained open. No one felt the need to close it anymore, because the part of the meeting that once required a private discussion had already been resolved. After that afternoon, something in our family shifted. Not dramatically. No apologies were demanded. No long conversations dissecting what had happened. But the way people spoke to me changed in small, noticeable ways. The first sign appeared a few days later when Daniel called. Normally, those calls started with a request. Mia, could you check something? Mia, do you know where this document is? But this time, the tone was different. Hey, he said, I was thinking about the house again. Do you mind if I run an idea by you? Not handle this, not look into that. Just run something by you. It was a subtle shift, but I heard it immediately. Respect doesn't always arrive as an apology. Sometimes it arrives as a change in language. Mark's behavior changed too. A week later, he sent me a message about a contractor he knew who specialized in historic home maintenance. Normally, the message would have read something like, "Can you call this guy and get an estimate?" Instead, it said, "Thought you might want this contact in case you ever need it for the house." No instruction, just information. Robert was the most interesting change. He never brought up that Sunday meeting again, but the next time we spoke, his voice carried a different tone. Less guiding, more collaborative. Have you considered what the neighborhood might look like in 5 years? He asked during one call. The question surprised me slightly, because for the first time he wasn't speaking as someone organizing the decision. He was speaking to someone making the decision. None of these shifts were dramatic, but they added up. And slowly, something else changed inside me too. For most of my life, I had thought of myself as the quiet person in the room, the reliable one, the one who handled details while others shaped outcomes. But that identity had never been entirely accurate. It had simply been the role everyone, including me, had grown comfortable with. The truth was something slightly different. I had never lacked a voice. I had simply chosen when to use it. And sometimes the strongest position in any situation isn't speaking first. It's understanding the structure well enough that when you do speak, the conversation changes. A few weeks after the meeting, I returned to the house again. The leaves outside had begun turning deeper shades of red and gold. Autumn always made the street feel quieter. Inside, the house looked exactly the same. Sunlight through tall windows, wooden floors carrying the soft creak of age. I walked into the study and sat down at the desk where the property documents were kept. The folder containing the deed was still there, the same simple piece of paper that had quietly shaped the entire situation. But when I looked at it now, I didn't feel any sense of victory. just steadiness, because ownership isn't really about control. It's about care, responsibility, patience, the same things my grandmother had trusted me with years earlier. I closed the folder and stood up, walking slowly through the house again. In the living room, sunlight stretched across the floor exactly where everyone had been sitting during that meeting. For a moment, I could almost hear the echo of Robert's voice. Maybe it's better if you stay out of the meeting. At the time, the sentence had sounded ordinary. Now it felt almost symbolic, because what they hadn't realized in that moment was something very simple. They weren't closing a door on me. They were closing a door inside a house I owned. And the interesting thing about doors like that is this: you don't have to knock. You already have the keys. When people hear this story, they sometimes expect it to end with anger, with a dramatic confrontation, with someone being humiliated in front of the whole family. But that was never the point. No one in my family was trying to be cruel. They were simply following a pattern that had existed for years. A pattern where certain people spoke first, and others handled the details quietly in the background. Those patterns feel normal until one day reality quietly reveals something different. And that's really what the story is about. Not revenge, not proving someone wrong, just clarity. Because sometimes the person everyone assumes has the least power in a situation is actually the person holding the structure together the entire time. The lesson I carried away from that afternoon wasn't about winning. It was about understanding something my grandmother had known long before I did. Real authority rarely announces itself. It doesn't shout across a room. It doesn't rush to correct every misunderstanding. It simply exists, steady and patient, until the moment arrives where the truth becomes visible to everyone. That day, when they asked me to stay out of the meeting, I realized something quietly ironic. They closed the door, but I owned the keys. And once you understand that kind of quiet position in life, you don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You just need to know when to speak. So I'm curious about something. Have you ever experienced a moment where people underestimated your role in a situation, only to realize later that you understood far more than they thought? I'd really like to hear your story in the comments.